Good evening and welcome to this live online discussion to launch the intriguing new book, The Next Pope, The Leading Cardinal Candidates by Edward Pentin and published by Sophia Institute Press. My name is Diane Montagna and I'll be hosting tonight's program, coming to you live from this stunning rooftop terrace in Rome. In fact, just a stone's throw away from the Sistine Chapel where conclaves are held. Taking part in this evening's live discussion is an array of distinguished guests. First of all, of course, is the author of this new book, the journalist Edward Pentin, who has spent many years covering the Vatican for a number of publications, including Newsweek and Newsmax, and is now the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register. Also here on the terrace with us is John Allen, the well-known Vatican analyst, founding president of Crux Media, and author of many books on the Catholic Church, including on the topic of conclaves and papal candidates. We're also honored to have with us Professor Roberto de Mattei, the respected Italian church historian, who's the author of many highly regarded works on the church and the popes. He's also the founder of the Italian Catholic website, Correspondent Romana. And last, but certainly not least, joining us from across the pond via television link is the acclaimed New York Times columnist Douthat, who wrote the well-received 2018 book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. So let's dive right into our discussion, and then we'll take a few questions from the viewers. Edward, perhaps you could open up our discussion by telling us a little bit about the genesis and about the content of the book.
Sure, Dan. Well, this book goes back a number of years. In fact, it began without me, and I came to it rather later on in it. But it was really a collaborative effort. It was originally started by a small group, and they saw a need for sort of equipping the cardinals, the College of Cardinals particularly, to know about the cardinals who could be elected pope, because there's been talk over the years that often the cardinals don't know each other. They don't know anything about each other often, and in fact I heard the other day that one of the cardinals at the last conclave said that there was a lot of confusion at the last conclave about who to vote for and their basic information about them. So this is really to equip them for that, and also for the faithful. I think everyone is always quite interested in who could be pope, and that this really aims to give them a good in-depth knowledge about who they are, the qualities they have, whether they have, for example, they have a reputation for holiness or for teaching or whatever. So it does do that, and it, as I say, it gives the faithful that all-round knowledge, and also allows them to know who to pray for, because if they might not want to know who to pray for during the conclave. So we hope very much that this book it can be a service to the Church, can be a service to the cardinals when a conclave comes. And as the content of the book is really based on these 19 cardinals who we thought have a good chance of being elected pope.
So these are profiles.
They're
of
profiles of each of the cardinals. They begin with a biography, a short biography detailing their service to the Church. Then you go through the three offices of the bishop and examining these offices in detail. So the sanctifying office of the bishop, the governing office, and the teaching office. And so it really goes into depth in that, and with footnotes as well, and referencing all the documentation that's been out there about them. So it's all there in one place for readers to access. And also there's an introduction which goes through the origins of the College of Cardinals. That goes back to the Old Testament even. And then the roles of the cardinals today, the modern day role. It goes into the details of how a pope is elected and all the mechanics of that. And it also has the papal qualities, the qualities needed for a pope. So in that sense, it's going to be, I think, a helpful reference point for when a conclave does come, and you'll have all of that together. It's very much, in a way, an encyclopedic reference manual, if you like, for the faithful and for the cardinals.
I think many people might be asking why you're publishing this book now when we already have a Pope and Pope Francis. So why now?
Sure. Well, it really goes to the point that conclaves are often announced, and it's a very short notice between when they're announced and when the actual conclave happens. And there's very, very little time in which to get to grips with who might be Pope. So we want to sort of preempt that, because of course we don't know when a conclave is going to happen. And so this is really so that we can be prepared, we know exactly who they are, and it doesn't have any bearing on this present pontificate or any past pontificate. But I should point out that a friend told me that Peter Hebblethwaite, a former correspondent, a Vaticanista for the tablet, he did a similar project during John Paul II's pontificate, and actually John Paul II outlived him by 10 years. So it doesn't have a good record, but hopefully I'll live to see the day of the conclave.
Yes, good. Well, you've all received and seen advanced copies of the book. John, maybe we could begin by talking about your general impressions of the book and what you think it's going to contribute to the church.
Sure. Well, let me begin by utterly laying waste to my reputation here tonight and confess openly in a live broadcast medium that I'm actually a friend of Edward Pentin. So I can't pretend to strict objectivity. I like Ed, and therefore I'm inclined to like his work. Now, that's not to say I'm not prepared to be critical. We'll see how the evening unfolds. But I've got my own personal list of your 19 picks that I find, frankly, totally preposterous, and we can hash all of that out. But two basic reactions. One, Diane, picking up on the question you just asked, Edward. Many moons ago, lost in the mists of prehistory, I also did a book about the next pope under John Paul II. It was called simply Conclave. And it had sketches of 20 cardinals at that stage that I thought could be elected pope. Now, I heard reactions at that time, and Edward, it would surprise me if you're not hearing some of this now, that it is disrespectful to the sitting pope to speculate about his successor while he is still alive, that it is disloyal, and that it can even be construed as an act of political sabotage, that you're trying to undercut him, style him as a lame duck. And frankly, my answer to that question then, as it is tonight, is just rubbish. That's just frankly false. All of us here, I'm sure, have spent time over the years talking to cardinals who have participated in a papal election. To a man, they will all tell you they were conscious that it was the single most important thing they were ever going to do in their lives. The Pope matters. And the last thing you want the cardinals to be is uninformed when they have to make that monumental choice. So, Edward, I don't think you have to say you hope this is a service to the church. I can declare dogmatically that this is a service to the church.
Good.
Now, the second point, second reaction, I guess, is this. I presume the logic for me being here is that I am the least identifiably strongly conservative figure on this panel. And so I guess it is incumbent upon me to say, having read the book, it clearly does reflect a kind of conservative view of things. I think, at parts, frankly, I thought I was reading a CPAC briefing book about the College of Cardinals. But having said that, let me just say this. What I have always admired about Edward, and I think it shines through in a particularly effective way in this book, is that he has a point of view like all of us do. Fine. But I will say this, I have never read Edward Pentin without learning something that I didn't already know. And so my pitch about this book would be, don't think it's only for a conservative audience. It's not. It may reflect a conservative point of view at some turns, but you will, no matter where you come from, you will learn a great deal you didn't already know. I mean, just to give you a trivial example, but it captured my imagination. When I was reading your chapter on Cardinal Zuppi of Bologna, I have to confess, I did not know that the Archdiocese of Bologna owns an automatic gate company business.
Yes.
This was a revelation to me, and so I started looking up this company. And there's got to be a metaphor in there about Francis's vision of a Chiesa in Uscita, right? So, I haven't worked it out yet.
Opening up doors. And
yeah, I know there's something promising there if I spend enough time thinking about it. But my point is, every one of these chapters, I mean, I have covered these cardinals most of my adult life. I like to think I know a great deal about them. I came away educated, edified, knowing more. Do I share your analysis at every turn? Can I see the conservative filter there? Sure. But then I can see anybody's filter. The test for me is not where somebody is coming from ideologically. It's how well do they know their turf. And you, Edward, you know your turf.
Thank you, John.
Well done. Ross, your thoughts on the book?
Well, so I would second what John said. I think that it's a book. It's written with a manifest point of view of sort of where the lines of orthodoxy and heresy lie and what's best for the future of the church. But in certain ways, that makes it arguably all the more useful for someone who disagrees with Edward to read. And I think you could imagine the book very profitably read by an extremely progressive Catholic as a guidebook to their preferred candidates for the conclave. They just have to rearrange a few sentences here and there in their mind as they go. So that's the first point. The other thing I'd say more generally is that this is obviously in line with, as both John and Edward said, previous books by previous authors sort of reflecting on future potential conclaves. But there are also two things that have changed in the church, one over the last 50 to 75 years and one just over the last 10 that makes this project distinctive. The first is just the globalization of the church, the fact that papal elections have gone from being something carried out primarily by a very European and very Italian body of cardinals, all of whom, or not all of whom, but many of whom know each other very well, who are sort of steeped in the internal politics of each other's roles as bishops and cardinals and archbishops, to being something that now, even more so under Pope Francis with his cardinal appointments, an election that sort of involves a completely far-flung church with cardinals from all over the world, many of whom aren't in Rome all the time, many of whom don't know each other. And in that sense, I think the role of the journalist, the sort of faithful Catholic observer, takes on a sort of stronger importance in certain ways than it might have in 1940 or 1840. I think the cardinals probably know each other less than would have been the case in the past. And then the other change, obviously, is the fact that we now have a Pope Emeritus, and the fact that the last Pope before Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, resigned. And that, too, creates, I think, a different atmosphere where it's not just that you're waiting for the possibility of God calling the Holy Father home. You're also waiting for a possible decision point from the current Pope, the current Pontiff, about when they're going to resign. And I think that, too, changes the landscape for a book like this, but also in certain ways makes it more relevant and important than, again, maybe it would have been even 20 years ago.
Professor de Mattei, what were your impressions of the book?
The first merit of this book, in my view, is that it reminds us that there will be a next Pope, and it is not a paradox, because the person of Pope Francis has obscured the institution he represents, and the debate between conservative and progressives, which in the years during the Second Vatican Council and in the post-Council era was an ideological debate, a debate of ideas. Today has been reduced to a debate between the friends and enemies of Pope Francis. And many of Pope Francis' supposed friends have an eschatological vision and see him as not the successor of Peter, but the successor of Jesus, a kind of Jesus II. And if it is so, there will be no next Pope, of course. But this eschatological vision characterizes also some of the enemies of Pope Francis, who consider him not Jesus II, but the Antichrist. And if Pope Francis is the Antichrist, after him will not be no other Pope, because we know that after the Antichrist there will be the return of Christ and the parousia. And so for me, Pope Francis is neither the Antichrist and neither Jesus II. It is more simply a bad Pope. And for me, as for many others, it is very important to know who will be the next Pope after Pope Francis. And the merit of Edward Pentin's book is not only that is a high-value journalistic investigation, but also that introduces us into the post-Francis era, the era of the next Pope.
Edward, John picked up on something. Some viewers might see that they might think that it's in bad taste to be publishing this book while Pope Francis is still alive. How would you respond to them?
Yes, well, it's just to explain, this is actually sort of a common idea. There are actually 3 projects, similar projects like this going on at the moment. There is this Red Hat report, but that's a very different project.
Which is a different project.
Different project and different goals. But we didn't see this really as sort of problematic or against the Church's tradition. And in fact, if you go back, and this is in what I put in the introduction, if you go back to the 1550s, even the Middle Ages, there were things called libelli, where there were lists of prospective cardinal candidates which were put up in Rome, and they were like the precursors to newspapers. But because they were kind of unreliable, and they were sort of like, I suppose we'd have to sort of like the bookies now, and they just sort of putting up lists of who they think might be Pope. Then people actually turned to diplomats and trusted scribes, trusted writers, to actually put together proper, reliable biographies of these cardinal candidates. And so, in a sense, this tradition goes back a long way. You could say it goes back to the Middle Ages, and it's no, as I said earlier, it has no bearing on the present pontificate, but it does, in a way, the aim is really to prepare the Church, prepare the cardinals and the faithful really for a conclave that could happen. So it's, as I say, it has a long tradition, so it isn't really in bad taste. So I can see how it might seem that way. Yeah.
Professor De Mattei, as a historian, is there anything that you'd like to add on that point of the fittingness or the unfittingness of publishing this kind of book, profiles on potential future popes while a reigning pope is still alive?
It is not the first time in history that profiles of popes are not perhaps published as a book, but diffused among the cardinals. It is a long tradition during the history of the Church to know once above all with grace or through the representative of the different government in Rome, the ambassadors, the diplomats. They always have prepared short biographies of all the papabili. And so I think that the book of Edward Pentin, it is in this exactly in this line.
Let's move to another topic, and that's what the impact of Pope Francis and his pontificate could be on the next conclave. Now, of course, Pope Francis has created numerous cardinals, but also, could the current crisis in the Church, whether it's the loss of vocations, that of course would be more here in Europe, the abuse crisis, financial scandals, or what some would see as a crisis of faith, how could that have an impact on the next conclave? And if so, what kind of impact might that have? Ross, you've written a book tackling this very issue. What's your take on it?
Well, so I think the conventional wisdom, which obviously those of you in Rome have a better handle on than I do, but I think the conventional wisdom is that the Francis pontificate has been such an era of sort of papal activity, intense media coverage of the papacy, and sort of particular pushes for reform or change driven by the Holy Father himself, that there may be a desire among the cardinal electors in the next conclave to sort of take the temperature down a bit and to, in effect, elect someone who may carry forward certain aspects of Francis's agenda or his ministry, but will be sort of present himself as less of a sort of charismatic leader for the Church and a little bit more of a retiring figure or a sort of functional figure. That would be the conventional wisdom. I think that was sort of a stronger argument maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when the arguments about Amoris Laetitia and communion for the divorced and remarried were at their hottest, the time I guess I was writing my own book. I think in the last couple of years, we've already had a little bit of a cooling of those tensions, where the Holy Father hasn't pushed as hard on certain issues, married priests and so on, than a lot of both conservatives and progressives expected. And then we've also had this moment in the Western world and really the whole world over the last few months with the coronavirus that's going to have tremendous repercussions, I think, for the church going forward. It's going to probably, at least temporarily, accelerate the decline of the institutional church in the West, and probably therefore accelerate some of the shifts in Catholic power and influence around the world. Obviously, it throws into uncertainty the Vatican's relationship with China, as China sort of deals with the virus and takes a more aggressive stance around the world. So I think this is in certain ways, it's a calmer moment in the church and a more fraught moment in the world than it was 2 years ago. And that might arguably push the cardinal electors to look anew for dynamism in certain ways, and worry less about the dangers of too much dynamism, which might have been the big worry a couple of years ago. But that's pure speculation. I'm curious what others think.
John, your thoughts?
Well, Dan, the way you teed this up is, what is Francis's impact going to be in the next papal election? Well, the primary impact any pope ever has on a papal election is that he appoints the Electoral College, right? By now, Pope Francis has appointed a little over 60%.
Yes, 67, I think.
67 of the voting age cardinals. Presumably, if the papacy goes on another 5 to 10 years, it will be well over 2/3, which is the number you need to elect a pope. And so I think, number one, it would be unreasonable to expect that a college of cardinals largely appointed by Francis will elect anyone who would be clearly seen as a repudiation of the Francis legacy. This is the reason I think a couple of your picks are a little, frankly, out there. But more than that, I think, and that's true all the time, okay? I could have said that about any papal election. I think the unique dynamic this time is the kinds of people Francis has been appointing, because Francis is not just globalizing in the sense that Ross described, that is, including more Latin Americans, including more Asians, including more Africans. But it's also where in those regions he is finding his cardinals. He is bypassing traditional centers of power and lifting up people who come from places that, frankly, most of us have never heard of. We now have a cardinal from the island of Tonga, for instance. We have a cardinal from Haiti who is not even from one of the two principal sees in Haiti, and on and on. In other words, there is always an X factor in every conclave that you can probably start. If there are going to be, say, 120 cardinals voting in a conclave, you can start usually with at least half of those guys you feel you've got a pretty solid read on, you know where they're coming from, you can guess who they would be willing to support, who would be outside their comfort zone, and then you have to worry about the other half. This time, I think it's going to be more like we'll have that sense about it, maybe a third of the college. And the other 2/3 are going to be wild cards. And I think that makes the business of trying to handicap this next papal election probably more complicated than it has ever been in at least the contemporary history of the papacy.
Professor de Mattei, your thoughts on the impact of Pope Francis's pontificate on the conclave?
I think that the impact on the next pontificate will be perhaps more important than the direct impact on the conclave. Of course, every pontificate has a relationship with the previous pontificate, whether if it is in a continuity or in a discontinuity with it. The pontificate of John the 23rd, for example, was in clear discontinuity, or for using your words, a repudiation of the legacy of the pontificate of Pius XII. And on the contrary, the pontificate of Paul VI was in the same line as that of John the 23rd. But the real problem today does not seem to me to be the relationship between a pontificate and another. but the relationship of the next Pope with Vatican II. Because all the popes have succeeded one another since 1965 have referred to Vatican II positively, albeit with, of course, some differences. But it seems to me that a strong historical review of Vatican II is underway, as is evident, for example, from the recent interventions of Archbishop Vigano or Bishop Schneider, who don't come from traditionalism, but who have honestly faced a theological and a cultural debate that seems necessary to me. So the relationship with the Vatican II, I believe that will be a key point in the next pontificate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Now let's widen out our discussion a bit and look at conclaves more generally. Professor de Mattei, I think that often when Catholics think about a conclave, they imagine a group of very pious cardinals going into the Sistine Chapel, very prayerfully asking the Holy Spirit for guidance as they vote. But what does history tell us about conclaves?
I think that there is a tendency among Catholics to believe that in a conclave the election is exclusive or almost exclusive work of the Holy Spirit, determined by the Holy Spirit. In reality, there is an assistance of the Holy Spirit, but this doesn't take away the freedom of the papal electors. So the cardinals are only assisted, but they are free to make mistakes. And I think that no theologian, but also no Catholic, could claim, for example, that the cardinals who elected the immoral popes of the Renaissance were enlightened by the Holy Spirit. So it may happen that the cardinals gathered in a conclave reject the influence of the Holy Spirit, because man is always free in history, even if he is a cardinal in a conclave. And of course, this does not mean that God is defeated by man or the devil, because God can allow the cardinals to elect a bad pope, but if it happens, it is because God is capable of drawing good from evil. And in this sense, for me, God is always a winner. God always triumphs in history and in eternity.
Let me pick up on something you said. I think also for our viewers who are watching, I think a lot of Catholics, when they think about a papal election or the Pope, they believe, and then probably the intention is very good, they believe that the Pope is handpicked by the Holy Spirit. But what do we really believe as Catholics, or what do we believe as Catholics about that?
Yes, I think that, of course, the Pope is always assisted by the Holy Spirit, not only during the election, but also during all his pontificate. But God leaves him free to correspond or not to correspond to his assistants, just as each of us can correspond or not correspond to the divine grace. And so we cannot attribute to the Holy Spirit the many faults of popes and men of church throughout history. And the distinction between the church, who is always pure and immaculate, immune from sins and errors, and the men of the church is fundamental, because the men of the church can make errors and can be sinners. So those who infallibilize every act of the Pope, in my view, do a grave wrong to the Church.
John, thoughts?
Well, my first thought is, I don't know what I'm doing here. In the last 5 minutes, this guy has used the words eschatological and infallibilize.
We're taking advantage of.
I don't even know what they mean.
We're taking advantage of his expertise, John.
So let me try to lower the tone a bit. Fundamentally, I think everything Professor de Mattei just said is absolutely right. I mean, you don't want theological insight from me, but the principle here would be that Thomistic principle that grace builds on nature, it doesn't cancel it out. So the fact that there is a divine element in the process of the selection of the Pope doesn't eliminate the need for good human judgment. I mean, you quote this in the book, Edward, of course. I've quoted it many times. In one of then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's interviews with the German journalist Peter Seewald, one of those book-length interviews he did before his election as Pope, Seewald once asked him, how should we understand the role of the Holy Spirit in a conclave? And what Ratzinger said is, well, clearly we should not understand it to mean that the Holy Spirit picks the Pope. In fact, probably the role of the Holy Spirit is simply to make sure that we don't bring things to a complete ruin. And he said the proof of that is there are obviously too many popes the Holy Spirit would not have picked. Right? And I think that's the way we have to understand it. And to circle back to where we began, look, I have, over the course of more than 20 years in this business, I have probably spoken to 4 dozen, 5 dozen cardinals who participated in 1 or 2 conclaves. And all of them have told me that while they did enter the Sistine Chapel in a deeply prayerful spirit, and they were genuinely trying to be open to the movements of the Spirit in their mind and their heart, they had also done their homework. I mean, I talked to one cardinal who had printed out everything he could find about 20 guys he thought were reasonable shots to be elected, had big manila folders, and stacked them in his suitcase and carried that with him on the plane, and that's what he read, on his flight from his hometown to Rome. And so, look, I think the dynamics are these. I think, from a Catholic point of view, we have to believe that the Spirit is active in a conclave. We have to believe there is also a grace of office for whoever emerges from that conclave as the Pope. And that deserves a kind of benefit of the doubt, but that does not eliminate from us, and certainly not from the cardinals, the responsibility to do the heavy lifting of making sure that the Holy Spirit does not catch them unaware.
Ross, your thoughts on Professor de Mattei's and John's perspectives?
I mean, one disagrees with Joseph Ratzinger at one's peril, but I think it is important to raise the possibility that the Holy Spirit could pick popes who are in hindsight seen as bad or dangerous or something else for some, for some more cosmic purpose, or, that it might be possible to have a pope elected in order to chastise the church in some sense. That's just, I just want to throw that out there as sort of a wild possibility. But that being said, I obviously agree with the points about the necessity of approaching the election as something that you treat seriously in human as well as divine terms, which certainly means doing your homework, and it certainly means recognizing that some form of politics plays a role. Obviously, there are all kinds of official rules that forbid certain kinds of politicking around a conclave. But I also think that this maybe especially for conservative Catholics in the current era, where there's all this talk about the idea that the Saint Gallen Mafia, this group of more progressive cardinals, sort of conspired to try and block the election of Benedict and to further the election of Francis. That kind of politicking has always been part of papal elections, and it hasn't always come from cardinals. There have been times when secular rulers have effectively vetoed potential candidates for the throne of Peter. So I think it's important to recognize the inevitability of politics, and as an extension of that, if you're in a factional dispute in the church, if you're in some sort of conflict over the future direction of the church, and you feel that your opponents are out politicking you, sometimes the answer is to do better at church politics.
Yes, let me pick up on that. Professor de Mattei.
Only to give you an example, every husband or wife receives a specific grace with the marriage, but not every husband and wife is a good husband and a good wife.
We have to correspond to God's grace, and we have the freedom to do so or not.
So
Yes.
So you receive the grace, but you have to correspond to this grace, and the responsibility is more grave if you have a high responsibility.
Yes, yes. I want to pick up on something actually that Ross mentioned, and that's we heard stories that in the 2005 conclave and perhaps also in the 2013 conclave that the St. Gallen group may have been campaigning and maneuvering. I wanted to ask you, Professor de Mattei, to what extent or not is campaigning for a particular cardinal legitimate or not legitimate in the conclaves?
According to the Constitution Universi Dominici Regis of John Paul II of 1996, the crime, for example, of simony, the boat, boat or the Pontificate, if this crime were perpetrated in the election of the Roman Pontiff, those who are guilty incur automatically in excommunication late sententia, and yet, what is important, the election is still considered valid. So this rule is very important in my view, because on the one hand it contemplates the possibility of a simoniac election, despite the Holy Spirit assistance. But on the other hand, the Pope strikes with excommunication those who are guilty or accomplices in this simoniac election. But this penalty doesn't strike who is elected. I mean, the Pope.
So the election is still
and
valid.
The same Constitution, at Articles 80, 81, prohibits, under pain of excommunication, all the authorities, secular groups or individuals who interfere in the election of the Pope, and there is the condemnation under pain of excommunication of all forms of agreements, promises, or other commitments among the cardinal. But it considers valid an election that resulted from these agreements and pledges. And no substantial change has been made from Benedict XVI in the Constitution Nullas Normas of 2013. And so, in my view, the St. Gallen Mafia could fall under the penalty of excommunication, but the election of Pope Francis remains valid.
Yes. Okay, let's go on to an important underlying theme of the book, and that's the qualities that would be needed for a good pope. Ross, let's go first to you. What should the cardinal electors be looking for in your view?
A man who's ready to do an impossible job. I mean, I think the framework that Edward uses in the book of sort of looking at.
Yes. Just a minute. We're having a few technical issues. We'll try to restore that. John, what do you think the cardinals should be looking for?
Well, I have written in the past that, in my view, the papacy, as we have come to understand it today, is an impossible job. I mean, think about what people expect popes to be, and I don't mean what's in the catechism or what's in the code, but in the street, what are the popular expectations? We expect popes to be towering intellectual giants. We want them to be political strategists and chess players. We want them to be Fortune 500 CEOs. By God, if the lights don't come on in my parish church this week, I want the Pope to do something about it. This ship is not being run well, right? We expect them to be cultural critics, to have something to say instantly about anything that happens in the culture.
To follow the 24 news cycle as well.
And to follow the 24/7 news cycle. And, of course, we also expect them to be living saints and moral heroes. Now, any one of those things is a life's work to do well. right? Trying to do all of them at once, in the sense in which the world seems to want it, is a prescription for perpetual heartburn. So I think cardinals have, therefore, if you were to ask them, give us a list of qualities that you would like to see in an ideal pope, they probably would give several qualities that would fit into every one of those categories. Mm-hmm. The problem is, the College of Cardinals is not now, and never has been, composed exclusively of perfect human beings. So inevitably, you have to pick and choose. I think the most important, this is another thing we could talk about. I think another novelty of this papal election is that I think it's probably going to be the first one in which a lot of conventional criteria that used to help cardinals sort through various possibilities aren't going to matter anymore. I don't think geography matters anymore. Mm-hmm. I don't think it matters whether the next pope is a European or a North American or an African or an Asian. I think we are in a post-geographic era, which is a product, first, of globalization, and secondly, of the fact that John Paul shattered the Italian monopoly in the papacy, and then Francis shattered the Western monopoly in the papacy. Today, it could really be anyone. Mm-hmm. Another issue is age. We used to go through all these gymnastics of, well, what's the right age profile? You don't want the guy to be too old because he's going to die too soon. You don't want to be young because you're going to be stuck with him forever. The last two popes have been elected at the ages of 76 and 78. Mm-hmm. And one went 8 full years and then chose to step off the stage. Of course, we don't know how long, Francis is going to go. I just think those issues don't matter anymore. I think we are at a point now, quite honestly, in which perhaps for the first time ever, cardinals can simply ask themselves one critical question. What is the best card we have in the deck right now? Mm-hmm. Who is the smartest, most compassionate, holiest, most competent guy? Regardless of how old he is, regardless of where he comes from, mm-hmm. and in some ways, regardless of his politics. Mm-hmm. I think, by the way, that's what happened in the conclave in 2005. Mm-hmm. I think going into that conclave after John Paul, there was a lot of momentum then for a pope from the developing world and so on. I think the cardinals just looked around and said, best card we have to play is Joseph Ratzinger. Mm-hmm. Didn't matter that he was German, and didn't matter that he was old. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good.
Go. Ross, I think.
Seems like you were choking back a reaction.
I was just wondering, you talked about orthodoxy earlier. How much do you think, John, orthodoxy or heterodoxy is going to come into this in the next conclave?
Well, I mean, I think it is fair to say that when cardinals elect the next pope, they will want to elect someone who is orthodox.
Or at least perceived to be orthodox. Or
well, Edward, as you well know, different people in the church have slightly different standards for what counts as orthodox. I mean, orthodoxy is one of those words like hope. Everyone's for it. I mean, the question is, how do you define it?
Right.
Right. I think there probably would be disagreements in this body of cardinals about precisely where the limits of orthodoxy ought to be set. But my point is, my read is, a solid 2/3 of these guys might look at a particular candidate and say, I don't agree with him on all of the issues, mm-hmm. but that's a pope.
Yes.
He's smart. He's competent. He cares. He has a big heart. And I think some of these other things will be secondary.
Ross, I think we have Ross back. Ross, what do you think that the cardinals should be looking for in the next pope? And did any of the 19 candidates in the book stand out to you?
I mean, I think that there's a challenge where I think the goal of the cardinals should be to find someone who embodies what you might call dynamic orthodoxy, which is to say what I think at his best Pope John Paul II was able to embody. A Catholicism that simultaneously doesn't leave people in serious doubt about what the Church is teaching and what it believes, but also seems to be engaged with where late modernity is going, engaged with where the developing world is going, and not just sort of building a bunker around the Church. So that's, but again, that description falls into John's category of, wouldn't it be nice to have the perfect saintly, dynamic, intellectual, globe-trotting figure. And I think it's hard to identify a sort of singular figure who fits that bill. And I mean, my perspective, we haven't really talked about particular candidates in the candidates in the book. I mean, I think again the sort of conventional view would be that there's sort of an institutional candidate who would be someone like Cardinal Parolin, who would represent sort of continuity with Francis, but perhaps a more institutionalist bent. There's a vision that would favor someone like Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines, who would seem to represent sort of the furthering of the Francis pastoral revolution that sort of tests the boundaries of orthodoxy, you might say, in pursuit of pastoral goals. And then, in theory, there should then also be a conservative candidate. And I guess I'm curious what the other panelists think, because I think I share some of John's doubts about the I guess, papabilité, if you will, of the most prominent conservative figures in the book, whether it's a Cardinal Raymond Burke, or a Cardinal Robert Sarah. I'm not sure who the sort of the candidate for cardinals who are worried that the Church has not sort of been sort of orthodox enough in certain ways under Francis and want a kind of dynamic figure. I'm not sure who that candidate would be, just from reading the book. So I'm curious what others think.
Professor de Mattei, your thoughts on what the cardinal electors should be looking for in the next conclave?
I think that John Allen is right when he says that the papacy today is an impossible job, but I think also that we have to add that this is true without the help of the divine grace, because all is possible with the support of the divine grace, the support of the divine assistance of the Holy Spirit. So I believe in the Holy Spirit. And for this, I think that the cardinals should choose a pope who has not to be political or worldly, but authentically religious, or more precisely a holy pope. So he would like a pope like a St. Pius X, a St. Pius V, a St. Gregory VII, or the St. Gregory the Fifth, because these are perennial models, not a historical pontificate, but perennial models. So a pope who would first of all confront the crisis within the Church, and then establish himself as a moral reference point for what remains of the Christian West in the face of the dangers of Islam, or the communist China, or other dangers. And perhaps it would be opportune, as a Cardinal Brandmüller hoped, that the next Pope would open his pontificate with a public profession of faith, as was once used, because there is, as Edward Pentin said, a serious problem of orthodoxy today within the Church.
And in the book, we've got 19 profiles. Were there any candidates within the book in whom you saw the qualities that you would see would be needed for the next Pope?
Yes, if I had a preference, I wouldn't express it so as not to harm my favorite candidate. But the truth is that it doesn't seem to me that any of the 19th papal candidates have the qualities that I would wish for a new pope. And this is not the first time that happened. In the Conclave of May 1605, Saint Robert Bellarmine, who was a cardinal elector, stated that he didn't not see any candidate with the qualities necessary to be pope. But there is always a surprise in the history, because either the election, for example, of St. Pius V or the St. Pius X were absolutely not predicted. So in this case, there is the possible intervention of the Holy Spirit.
John, your thoughts about the 19 profiles, and was there anyone who stood out to you as a potential next pope? And also, just setting aside your own preferences, who do you think might be most likely to be elected?
Well, you're lucky because I don't get paid to have preferences. You know, I'm constitutionally disallowed from having preferences, so I'll just try to handicap the reality as I would see it. I think most of the people Edward has on his list are plausible candidates. I would agree with Ross. I think Cardinal Raymond Burke, Cardinal Robert Sarra. I personally think both of them, whether this is fair or not, would be so clearly perceived in a social media age as an almost complete repudiation of the Francis papacy that I don't think that's going to happen, particularly with a group of cardinals, the vast majority of whom have been named by this pope. I think probably of the remainders, I would handicap it pretty much like Ross did. I think probably Paroline is the safe bet. Like, if somebody put a gun to your head right now and said you have to bet your life savings on one guy, that would probably be the name you would want to go with. I think for the, whatever you would call it, the continuity camp, the more progressive camp, certainly Cardinal Luis Antonio, or as he is known, Chito Tagle, probably would be their bet. I think Ross's question is a very good one. You know, one of the smartest bishops I know, a year ago, we're having dinner here in Rome, and he asked me if there were a St. Gallen group of the center-right today, who would they be coalescing behind? Like, who would be the plausible conservative candidate right now? It was a hard question to answer then. It's a hard question to answer now.
Want to take a stab?
Sure. Here's what I think. I think for the more conservative bloc in this conclave, okay, goes in knowing they're not going to get a Burke or a Sarra. They're probably not even going to get an Angelo Scola. I mean, he's probably, poor Cardinal Scola, he was a viable candidate the last couple of times. I think some people may think that his moment has come and gone. But they're probably not even going to get him, right? So, what they're looking for is someone who may not exactly be in their camp, but someone with whom, if I can use this kind of language, with whom they think they can do business, who at least understands where they're coming from and is not going to go too far too fast.
Compromise.
But meanwhile, it has to be somebody who is also acceptable to that 2/3 plus faction in the college that was appointed by Francis and doesn't want anybody who's going to be seen as just throwing that out the window, right? Who did he come up with? Well, my logic leans me to Cardinal Christoph Schönberg of Vienna, the Dominican, who was once known as the doyen of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, kind of the crown prince, right, under Ratzinger, general editor of the Catechism. For most of his career, had a reputation as a fairly strong conservative. Now, during the Francis papacy, has backed the Pope at certain critical junctures. That have led people to kind of, or at least some people, to redefine their impressions of Cardinal Schönborn. But above all, the thing about Cardinal Schönborn is that he is not an ideologue. He is an incredibly deep mind. He is an original thinker. He is unpredictable. And he will end up sometimes on some issues in positions that we would conventionally see as conservatives and others as a progressive. That's either going to make him a man without a country or the consensus favorite.
Exactly.
One of those two things will happen.
Very good. Professor de Mattei.
I give you an example. In the past, two possibly papabili, Cardinal Martini and Cardinal Bertone, worked to become popes. They worked very much. But for Cardinal Martini, there was he fallen ill, and his disease which avoided the election. And for Cardinal Bertone, there were some scandals. And so, for example, two candidates who seemed to be very favorite, very sure in the last years, were finished in in a short time. So I think that nobody can be sure about this election. I think that the book of Edward Pentin could be useful more than to define the next pope, to define the opposite blocks, because in a conclave there are the leaders of the opposite blocks, for example, leaders of more conservative or more progressive. I give you an example. After the Pontificate of Pius X, Cardinal Mary del Val was the leader of the cardinals who collected the legacy of Pius X, but he had never the possibility to become pope, and so. But he worked in the conclave to help other candidates to become. And so you have seen, for example, speaking about Cardinal Burke, that he's too perceived as a conservative for becoming a pope, but he can be within a conclave a reference point for a leader of a bloc.
We're gonna, if I can interrupt for a moment, we're going to need to say goodbye, and thank you to Ross, he has to leave us. So thank you very much, Ross, for joining us.
Bye, Ross.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. I wish I was in Italy, but this was the next best thing.
We wish you were here too. Bye bye. Yeah, so I'm sorry, Professor de Mattei, did you have anything to add?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to talk about something really quickly, and that's for the first time in history, we have a Pope Emeritus. Now, if a new conclave were to be held in the very near future, how do you think that his presence might affect it? John?
Well, I might be in a minority on this point, but I don't think it would have much effect on it at all.
Yeah.
You know, there's a little bit of, like, Catholic craziness whenever anything happens for the first time. And we all want to spin out these, like, scenarios about, you know, schisms and riots and, you know, confusion. I'm sure the first time a retired diocesan bishop hung around in a diocese while his next guy took over, people went a little bit nuts trying to figure out how that was going to work. And then, you know, in a couple of weeks, they all get used to it because, you know, it's clear who's in charge. Similarly, I don't think there's a Catholic on the planet today confused about who was actually in charge in the Catholic Church. I don't think cardinals who are going into the next conclave are going to feel, you know, one of two extremes. Either the more progressives would be worried about Benedict as a kind of behind-the-scenes influence and therefore try to push even harder to counteract fears of that influence. I don't think the conservatives are going to be taking their cues from the Mater Ecclesiae monastery where Benedict is living. Assuming that the Pope Emeritus is still with us when this happens, I think he would move heaven and earth to keep a very respectful distance and silence. And so I think the dynamics of the conclave, whether there is a Pope Emeritus or not, at least with this Pope Emeritus, who is so respectful, so humble, so selfless in so many ways, I don't think they would be fundamentally any different.
Professor de Mattei, your thoughts?
I agree with John Allen, and more I hope that Benedict XVI will not exert any influence on the new conclave, because unfortunately his resignation, with his resignation, he has assumed a very serious responsibility for the confusion the Church is in today. And so I hope that the next conclave will not aggravate the confusion, but possibly put an end to it.
Very good. We're going to now take a couple of questions from viewers. Both of them come from Facebook. The first question is for our panel. Do the qualities today that make a good pope today, or the qualities that in history made for a good pope, are they the same qualities that are needed for a pope today? Edward, any thoughts?
Well, I think clearly a new pope today has to be pretty media savvy. I would say that's something that hasn't been the case. Well, it has in modern history, but I think even more so now. And not that they should be on social media necessarily, but
tweeting,
but they do need to have a certain.
Although Pope Francis does tweet, not necessarily Pope Francis himself, but he does have an
yes.
account.
But so I think that's one key element. But also, this, as we were saying earlier, that the whole, or John was saying, the whole globalized setting now, the fact that the church is so, it's always been international, but that's a greater emphasis now, and there has to be that greater awareness of the realities of the church in every part of the world. It can't be Eurocentric anymore. So I think that's another element too. But yeah, there's certainly, as we were saying earlier, lots of challenges that a modern Pope now has.
John?
Well, I mean, different historical situations have beckoned different gifts from different popes, right? I mean, when the Pope was also a secular ruler, sometimes they had to worry about ginning up an army to go fight a crusade, which is not a task we're assuming that contemporary popes are going to face. I think fundamentally the basics are probably eternal, right? I mean, what you want in any leader, and, magari, as we say here in Italy, certainly in a pope, you want fundamentally, I would think, an open, curious mind, a big heart, and deep holiness. And you give the church those three things. The church is remarkably resilient. The famous line from Monsignor Knox that the ultimate proof of the divinity of the church is that any other institution run with such navis imbecility would be dead in a fortnight, right? But you give the church those three things, I think it can muddle through. I would agree with Edward that I think some consciousness of the dynamics of the modern media, without being a slave to those dynamics, but a consciousness of those dynamics is important. I think increasingly some kind of aptitude for management is important. I mean, we have seen now 4 consecutive popes attempt to work a kind of structural reform of the inner management of the Vatican. Yeah. And whatever else those 4 popes have achieved to date, they have not achieved that. And so some kind of some reason to believe that there is a kind of aptitude for that sort of thing would probably be important. But beyond that, it is so impossible. I mean, who knew when Pope Francis was elected in March 2013 that he was going to be the Pope to preside over the coronavirus? Yeah. And by the way, whatever else you want to say about Pope Francis's, occasional seeming indifference is too strong a word, but the liturgy is perhaps not highest on his to-do list all of the time. The liturgies he gave us during this period, and I think particularly that March 27th Urbi et Orbi, that haunting liturgy in a deserted St. Peter's Square, where the only sound you could hear was the falling rain, his voice, and the sirens of ambulances in the background. Him flanked by Maria Salis Popolo Romani and the crucifix from San Marcello. That was magnificent. And I don't think anybody could have predicted that this Pope would have that in him at that moment, because none of us knew it was coming, right? So I would fall back on those basics. An open mind, a big heart, personal holiness, adaptability, and the Church's capacity to muddle through. We'll see to the rest.
Professor de Mattei, your thoughts?
The historical context can change, of course, but the model is always the same, because every pope during the history has always first to reform the church, and second, fight against the internal and external enemies of the church, because the church is a militant church with enemies, and the mission of the Pope, it is to defend the Catholic people against the enemies, and so it is, in my view, a perennial model. In my view, today the ideal Pope would be St. Pius V.
Excellent, excellent, fascinating discussion. We're going to have to leave it there. But Edward, I wanted to offer you the possibility. What were your takeaways from this evening's conversation, and was there anything you wanted to add about the book?
Right.
Be honest, probably number one is never invite John Allen to the right?
And if you agree
No,
with all of my picks, that would be...
Put him at the top of your list.
No, I think it's a very interesting discussion. And thanks, obviously, for coming. But it's I think it is going to be a very contentious, obviously, conclave coming up. And I think what you say, Professor de Mattei, about the church having to be militant, I think that's going to become more so probably in the future when we have these external and internal threats. And I think that will have a bearing on the conclave as well. But I just want to say about the book that I do hope it is of service, because it is. I hope it wasn't too ideological, John, but I really tried to make it very factual and objective. But there probably it does seem to be to some perhaps veering to the conservative
The
side.
point is, no matter where you are in the compass, no matter what you think you know,
Yes.
you will be better informed about these 19 men on
Yes.
the basis of reading this book. And for that alone, Edward, it is a huge service.
Good.
And we all thank you for it.
Well, thank you.
I think so the same. It would be a really very useful book for, above all, for the cardinals
Yes.
Yes.
gathered in the next
Yeah, I
conclave.
can guarantee you're going to have at least 19 sales as soon as this thing hits the shelves.
Well, I've been saying that it's 19, but I expect the 20th will be the one that's picked and it's in the book.
Yeah.
But no, thank you very much for coming. And just for viewers to know that the book should be available at the end of July or the beginning of August, and you can pre-order it on Sophia Institute Press website.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you for the book, and many thanks to our distinguished guests for coming to tonight's program and sharing their insights. Ross Douthat, Professor Roberto de Mattei, and John Allen. Thank you all for watching. To pre-order The Next Pope, The Leading Cardinal Candidates, visit Sophia Press's website at www.sophiainstitute.com. That's www.sophiainstitute.com. From all of us here in Rome, we hope you enjoyed the discussion. Good evening and God bless.